The views and opinions expressed in the following podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the producers, the affiliates, or digital platforms hosting this podcast. All content is for the purposes of education, conjecture, and at times entertainment. We promote inclusiveness and diversity. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Into the Deep with Jay Costa.
Welcome to Into the Deep. I'm Jay Costa. I am enthralled by today's guest. He's a medical doctor with a background in physics and a lifelong interest in science. He's also an author and recognized as a leading scientific expert on the Shroud of Turin. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew Silverman. Dr. Andrew Silverman, for over 30 years, has been conducting research on the mind-matter continuum, near-death experiences, and the Shroud of Turin. He's presented his findings in peer-reviewed scientific papers and at international scientific conferences. We talk about so much. We talk about a team from Italy in the 1970s that performed forensic analysis of the Shroud of Turin. And we talk about the question that arose. Could it be that the image that appeared on the Shroud of Turin was created by a short, intense burst of radiant energy? So, join me as we seek light and journey into the deep with Dr. Andrew Silverman. Enjoy. Dr. Silverman, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Really means a lot to me. If you could, for our listeners and our viewers, can you share with us who you are and what it is you do?
Right. Well, my name's Dr. Andrew Silverman. I'm a medical doctor, but I've had a lifelong interest in science as well. And I've been fascinated from a very early age in basically the questions that so many people are fascinated by, I suppose, the nature of what is humanity, the nature of consciousness, and the nature of existence. And I've tried to approach these questions through a rational, sort of evidence-based approach. But of course, as Descartes pointed out, there is the evidence of our existence. I think, therefore I am. And this is fundamental to understand, I believe, the nature of being and of consciousness and how the two are related. And so when I was just around 13, 14 years old, I was fortunate to see a videotape of a documentary about the Turin Shroud called The Silent Witness. It was made by David Rolfe. He won a BAFTA for it. And this was looking at the scientific evidence around the Turin Shroud, the image upon it, and so on, and the bloodstains and so on. And this was a bunch of scientists who had gathered in Turin, who'd come at it completely open-minded with no preconceived notions, and definitely they had not come from there was no unifying religious affiliation of them. Some of them were Jewish, some were Christian, some, I believe, agnostic, and so on. And they assumed when they went to see it that they were just going to be looking at another, in quotes, religious relic. And they thought they're going to go there and find the brush strokes, and then they could go home again, because they assumed this must have been done by an artist or a forger. And these were scientists, not amateurs. These were people who had worked with NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Los Alamos, and so on. And they were just completely stunned when they realized that that's not what this was, that there are bloodstains upon it, and these bloodstains have been tested and shown to be human blood, and and the pattern of the bloodstains allows a forensic analysis to be done of how those bloodstains appeared on the shroud. And it appears that, sadly, the man whose image is contained within the shroud, that he had been, before his death, and he was dead when the shroud wrapped him, we can see forensically, he had been tortured, whipped, had a cap of sharp objects placed upon his head, and he'd been crucified. And so that's what we can see forensically from the blood and what's known as serum stains. Then, as well as that, there's the image of the man, which for centuries was thought to be just a sort of faint sepia image that looks sort of like a man, until the advent of photography. And in 1898, someone called Secunda Pia was given permission to take a photograph of the shroud using, what was then the early days of photography. So the younger viewers might not be aware that before digital cameras came out, people had to expose a film to light, and then you had something called a photographic negative, which basically has all the tones reversed. And it's said that Secunda Pia nearly dropped his photographic plate in shock when he saw the negative of the shroud image, because the negative appears like a positive, and you can see clearly once you look at the negative that this is actually an image of a man, and you can see front and back of the man. The shroud had been apparently when he was put in the tomb, he'd been laid upon the shroud, and the shroud had been reflected over the top of the head and so on, and the image is there of the back and the front, with a gap over the top of the head. Now, in the 1970s, a physicist called John Jackson had made another landmark discovery about the shroud when he used something known as an image intensifier, which had been used to sort of study more detail about X-ray images and so on, and it basically translates the intensity of the image into relief, a distance. So if you do that with an ordinary photograph, then what you see is sort of random peaks and troughs. But when you do it with the shroud image, what you see is it comes out in relief, and you're seeing the three-dimensional image of the man. And and then when they studied the image on the shroud fibers, what they found was that there was nothing had been added to the fibers to make the image. Where the bloodstains were, you see, as you would expect, that the liquids from the blood had soaked through and fibrils were matted together. But where the actual images are, it's actually only on the superficial fibrils, and it's only 200 nanometers in thickness, which is 1/5000th of a millimeter. And it doesn't consist of any chemicals that have been added, but rather what they found was it's oxidation and dehydration of the surface cellulose, which is very similar to what happens to paper when it's exposed to sunlight and it's turned slightly yellow. And I believe this is what led certain scientists, including Dr. Di Lazzaro and his team at the Atomic Energy Institute in Italy, to do studies using pulsed ultraviolet lasers on linen, following up on an idea that had originally been suggested by Dr. John Jackson, that the image, and his team that studied the shroud in the 70s, that the image, the only way they could account for how the image could have got on there was a short, intense burst of radiant energy to form this photographic negative image, which had distance coded information. Because unlike with a photograph where you have reflected light, to have the distance coded information implies that the source of the light is the body of the man that was wrapped in the shroud. And what Dr. Di Lazzaro and his colleagues found is that they could duplicate at a microscopic level, they could duplicate the changes in the surface fibrils that occur on the shroud. And but they said that they're using even 20th or 21st century technology, we still wouldn't be able to make an image like that. It would take something like 1,000 billion watts of lasers and so on. So it doesn't look like this is a man-made image in the sense of it's not been sort of made as an artifice. It hasn't been manufactured, but somehow it has occurred. And so that got me really fascinated. Of course, I didn't know about Dr. Tilasaro's research it hadn't happened yet when I saw the video in the early 1980s. But that got me going on a journey, thinking, how is that possible that a human being, a dead human being, would momentarily shine brighter than the sun like that? What would cause such a thing to happen? And what does that tell us about the nature of humanity, the nature of all of us as human beings, and what our potential might be? And then I went on to study science and to study medicine and so on, and got to hear about other phenomena such as near-death experiences, where just as it seems that the image on the shroud was formed by a sudden intense burst of radiant energy from a dead body. Well, in NDEs, in cardiac arrest, after the brain waves are already flat, the consciousness it persists. Not only does it persist, but there is information that is gleaned during that experience that can later be verified in what are known as veridical near-death experiences, so that people are looking from above the body that the team are trying to resuscitate, and they are observing specific data that relates to their particular resuscitation events that happen. One example is, someone was resuscitated after a cardiac arrest, and people were looking for his false teeth. And he said, he described the nurse who had taken them away and what direction she'd taken them in during his cardiac arrest, because he'd been watching it from above. And at a time when not only was he, to all intents and purposes, clinically dead, but the brain waves would have been flat. There was nothing happening in his brain, and yet his consciousness was persisting. And then I got to, studying about quantum mechanics and the work of some of the pioneers of quantum mechanics, such as Erwin Schrödinger, Max Planck, and later Eugene Wigner, who the first two were interviewed, and I've got the archive department of the London Observer newspaper kindly furnished me with copies of it. In the 1931, I believe it was, both Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger were interviewed for the Observer newspaper about consciousness, and each of them went on the record to say that they believe consciousness is completely fundamental and cannot be created from anything else. It's not a product of matter, in other words.
Right.
And then Eugene Wigner, in his one of his books, he wrote that once the equations of quantum mechanics were available, it became, he believed, impossible to understand what was going on unless consciousness was taken to be the fundamental aspect of reality. It's what's known as the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And so, tying in these three different fields was really what led to my book, A Burst of Conscious Light. And the other thing that really sort of prompted it was I've seen how things are moving, where things are going now with technology, in the search for artificial intelligence and the notion of transhumanism and people's wishes to try to discover some form of mind uploading. Now, the thing is that once you understand consciousness, I believe you begin to see, once you start to at least, you begin to see that for reasons that I explain in great depth in the book, consciousness can never be manufactured. It can never have a beginning. And this is a point, actually, although I said, as I say, I explain it in the book, that knowledge has been around for a long time. In fact, Owen Schrödinger, in his seminal work called What is Life, that he published in the 1940s, he made a very important point about consciousness and time. That, you see, time is, although we sort of consider it in everyday terms as though it's flowing, if you actually, as soon as you start to think about it, that doesn't make any sense. How is it flowing? Where is it flowing? What does it mean to move at 1 second per second, and so on? But when you actually sort of pin it down, the only thing we ever experience is now.
Right.
Okay. All of what we are is now. But the equations of physics don't have a now. They have, as it were, the whole of existence from Big Bang to the heat death of the universe is all laid out as a sort of what some people call a block universe, that there's no moment, there's no flow. And yet we perceive a flow. We perceive, well, at least we don't perceive a flow, but we perceive a distinction between past and future. The past is fixed and the future is not yet fixed. Okay, and that's how we have a sense of freedom of choice, because the future is not yet fixed, and hence we can fix it. And now, the fascinating point is that this, it's often said that, oh yes, we have that, but that's just an illusion created by the brain. But to have an illusion, you have to have one who perceives an illusion. You can't. What cannot be an illusion is the viewer of the illusion. Otherwise, who is perceiving that them? It only can be an illusion once it's perceived. And the perceiver, therefore, cannot be an illusion. And the point that Schrödinger came to is that since now, the mind is always now, as he put it, he proposed that, again quoting him, the indestructibility of mind by time. Okay, because time is a product of the mind, not the other way around. And therefore, as he put it in his book, as I say, he said, I propose the indestructibility of mind by time. That which mind brings to the fore, time, cannot have the power of creating it or annihilating it. Since time is only there because of mind, mind can't begin or end in time. Therefore, we must be eternal. We have no beginning or end. You cannot create consciousness. And if you think about it, what is computer information? People say it's like Tononi says, it's once you get information that's sufficiently complex, and somehow it gets to a magic threshold, and then it wakes up and is someone rather than something, and consciousness is there. Well, have a think about that for a moment. What is information? It's a string of ones and zeros, right? Mm-hmm. Or at least it can be expressed in strings of ones and zeros. Now, how long do you have to make a string of ones and zeros before it suddenly wakes up and becomes a being rather than an object? You can't. And any child could realize this. And I think this sort of logical fallacy about artificial intelligence may have been what led Professor Sir Roger Penrose, as he is now, to write his book in the late 1980s called The Emperor's New Mind. You know, like the Emperor's New Clothes, that all the people who want to seem learned and clever and wise wanted to praise how wonderful the Emperor's new suit was, but a little child said, but he hasn't got any clothes. And it's the same with artificial intelligence. The point that Penrose makes is that for something to be intelligent, it has to understand, right? To understand, it has to be aware, so it has to have consciousness. Now, the problem is, of course, in semantically, that people might use the term artificial intelligence to mean very efficient processing of information, machine learning, which of course that does happen. But it happens as well to a pebble on a beach. Okay, and I'll explain that. The waves of the sea erode the stone, right? And the stone, therefore, by very similar thing to natural selection, Okay, it arrives at a state of the curves on it that get formed by that erosion are such that the further erosion is slowed down, it's minimized, it's learning, in quotes, about what's happening, what direction the water is coming from. It's not learning anything, of course, it's not conscious. And in the same way, a machine can be, as information goes into it, that can change how further information will produce a different output, which you could say is machine learning. But there is no one who feels and experiences I am the machine, who is aware of that information any more than my first electronic calculator that I had in 1979, that when I press 1 + 1 = and 2 came out, it doesn't know what 1 is. It doesn't know what addition or equals or what 2 is. It's no different to an abacus. And the problem is people get fooled because so often as a species, we tend to be quite visual. So if they start to make machines that have a human shape and have a soft outer coating that looks like skin and have eyes that reflect light, then people will start thinking that they're just like human beings. And of course, they're not. And if you listen to, there are two institutes of learning that have been recently founded in recent decades in the UK at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. At Cambridge, they have one called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and in which had among its members Professor Stephen Hawking and the Astronomer Royal Professor Lord Martin Rees. And they also, in Oxford, I believe there's Professor Nick Bostrom and several other people at the Future of Humanity Institute. And both of these institutions are considering a very, very important question, a vital question, one of the biggest. What might be the things that might put human existence at risk, existential risk of the human species? And of course, warfare, climate change, asteroids, all of these things are possible. But what many of these teams have considered is that possibly one of the most likely things that might put humanity at risk is that it either is considered to become redundant or might be destroyed as a result of unanticipated consequences of technology. Examples that are often given is, say, for example, so that people don't have to work, you have machines, robots, whatever you want to call them, that do all the hard work, and also look after people's health and so on. Put me out of a job as a medical doctor. Well, then let's say you have to set their aims and objectives and goals and tell these machines, robots, whatever they are, what they have to achieve. So let's say that you program them to do whatever it takes to avoid human suffering. Now, to a machine, what's the most efficient way of avoiding human suffering? There's two things, right? It could do. One is to wipe out humanity, because then it will, it's very logical. Then there's no human suffering. Or two, put all human beings anesthetized on heroin drips and leave them there unconscious and sort of happy, and then there's no human suffering. So you see, and then the other, so that's just a sort of stark example of how some of these scientists have said imagining ways that it could happen. Then you start to look at what can be the consequences of people not understanding what I consider, and I'm not alone in this. I quoted people like Planck and Schrödinger as to be the specialness and fundamentally unique nature of consciousness, that it's different to anything in the universe because it's not a thing. Okay, once you lose sight of that, and once you get fooled by the emperor's new mind of artificial intelligence and think, oh, it's all just information, then what do? You think, well, our bodies start to get, as we get older, they start to creak, then we get arthritis and various things. So people will start to say, well, why not take all the information in your brain, and some people have already started to think in these terms, and just put it into a computer, and then you can carry on through that and be eternal. And then you can just put your body in the incinerator. You don't need that anymore because you're alive forever in the and just as and then humanity is gone, not with a bang but a whimper. Okay. And I mentioned Professor Martin Rees and Professor Stephen Hawking. Each of those learned people have at certain times pointed out that if we were to have contact from an extraterrestrial intelligence, it would most probably not be something that they call organic intelligence. It probably wouldn't be living, because it's taken as read, if you like, that once we start to develop advanced technology, it's not very long until the species that has done that becomes either extinct or redundant. And you see, and so they expect the same thing to happen on Earth as well. That actually, as our technology goes up exponentially, it won't be long until the future beings that live here, that are in a sense the descendants of humanity, not biological descendants, but what is left after us, will no longer be biologically alive. And it's what's amazing to me is that people with such expertise have said this, but there doesn't seem to have been much reaction in the world. That you would have thought that this notion that humanity's days might be numbered, not by some religious person holding up placards saying the end is nigh or anything like that. This is mainstream science.
Right.
That people don't, either they're not aware of it or they don't seem that bothered by it. But I am. You see, I think that this is a very important thing, and is definitely worth, speaking about, and worth writing books about, worth trying to say to people, look, consider what, and this is again to paraphrase Schrödinger. He said, dear reader, imagine when you come to your child comes to greet you, and you have a toy for the child, and see the light and the happiness in their eyes. Now, in the world according to physics, all that's happening is that you're just looking at a pile of atoms, and there's photons bouncing off those eyes, and that's all that it exists, and we're just all stuff, we're just all matter, and that's all there is. He said that's the reality suggested ordinarily, conventionally by physics, a strange reality. He said something seems to be missing, and he highlighted what that is. And again, this isn't he's not some sort of guru or a mystic. This is what a Nobel laureate physicist who recognized that this is what reason was telling him. Reason and evidence were pointing to the fact that he was happy to go on the record to say that consciousness is fundamental. And there are some scientists in modern times as well. There's Professor of Physics at the University of Stanford, Andre Linde, who is one of the most eminent physicists of the modern day, and who in his textbook that he wrote 30 years ago about something called inflationary theory, not economics, but universe inflationary theory. He had a section about the origins of the universe and so on. And in that, he said that he believes that the evidence suggests that the universe requires consciousness throughout, that there cannot be a universe, that the equations of quantum theory. It's actually something called for viewers who are interested more about it, it's called the Wheeler-DeWitt equation for the wave function of the universe. That without a conscious observer, nothing can happen. That there's no time, there's no change, and everything remains at zero. And he was interviewed about this, and he said that when he when he was going to put this in his book, his publisher said to him, "You realize if you put this thing in your physics textbook about consciousness being fundamental, you might lose the respect of your colleagues." And he said, if I hadn't put it in there, I would have lost my self-respect. So this is the thing that scientific evidence and reason point to the fundamental nature of consciousness, that we have no beginning or end. Our bodies are conceived and born, and we die, but that's not our beginning, and it's not our end. And once we realize that, then we realize that each individual human being, however, whether they're a pauper or a prince or whoever they are, wherever they are in the world, has a significance and a value greater than all the atoms in the universe, and that actually all of existence centers on each of them. Or if there were other planets out there in the universe that have living sentient being, it would be the same for them. It's not a sort of pre-Copernican notion that I'm saying that Earth is the center of being. I'm saying consciousness, wherever it is the center, and not based on any sort of religious sense, but based on reason and evidence. Now, it's interesting, talking of religious sense, that people often assume, or many scientists and people who read popular science may assume, when they read people like Richard Dawkins and so on, that science as a whole has a habit of following evidence and reason, and seeing how you can avoid having dogma. But many of these people, such as Dawkins, they have stronger faith than many religious people. They have such a strong faith in their articles of dogma, such as that consciousness must be just a product of the brain. There's nothing else that it can be. So if you listen to, for example, Rupert Sheldrake talk, he talks about how scientists will come into a debate with him about the existence of telepathy. Now, the scientists who are debating it with him, obviously because he believes that it exists, he's seen the evidence that suggests that it does. And so the opponent on the debate is one who says, no, it doesn't exist. And generally speaking, those people haven't even bothered to look at the evidence. See, in their mind, they don't need to look at the evidence because it's physically impossible. According to their worldview, there couldn't be such a thing.
Right.
So why waste your time looking at the evidence of something that's impossible? It's like going to interviewing a batch of dentists to ask if they've ever met the tooth fairy. In their minds, it's just there's no point in doing it. Mm-hmm. They don't see, though, that means that they are adherents of a metaphysical dogma, school of dogma, that has certain articles that aren't open to question, that they must be true, despite the fact that all of these other scientists have been, convinced by the evidence that they do exist, and they don't even need to look at that evidence. They just are happy to dismiss anyone who as being a fool who would even consider it. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's really why I wrote the book.
I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing. This is. I know you said you were 14. You're watching this documentary. Did you ever think at that point in time? Did you fast forward in your mind to where you would be today in any way or any capacity?
Well, I suppose I sort of did, in the sense that that I thought whatever anything that sort of I realized through it, and I should say at the start that someone, a friend of mine, once made an interesting point that we all, each human being, we each have our own brand of nonsense, right? Our personalities, and I'm the same as anyone else in that. But nobody has their own brand of truth. So anything that I discover or anything that I realize was true before I realized it. So it in that sense, it's not original. So I think that many of the points that I make in the book were have been being made by other people for thousands of years.
Mm.
Okay, so I don't believe all that I've done is recognize that what they were saying made sense, and seen how it makes sense to me, and hopefully I can express that in a way that makes sense to others. And I thought, I've always thought that if I do understand anything, then I have a duty that seems valuable to me. I have a duty to try and share that with other people. And even when I was at school, I was doing talks in assemblies at school about questions about origins and consciousness and so on. So I sort of did, but it was actually a friend of mine who suggested, why don't you put this into a book? And then I started writing. Well, it was actually after I'd given a talk on the Turin Shroud at the what it was called, the International Workshop for Scientific Study of what known as akeiropoietos images, which is Greek for not made by the hand. And that actually was held at the Italian Atomic Energy Institute that I mentioned in Frascati. And after I'd given my talk there in 2010, then some friends of mine said, why don't you write a book about what you've said? And because I don't sort of prepare talks in advance, I sort of have I don't use notes. I just sort of do it as it sort of comes to me through questions that are asked and so on. And so I started writing about the Turin Shroud, and then I realized that this is a piece of cloth, that to make sense of what happened, of how that image formed, couldn't be done without understanding the man who was wrapped in that shroud. And to understand the man who was wrapped in that shroud, you have to understand humanity. To understand humanity, you have to understand consciousness, because without consciousness, humanity is just a pile of atoms. And so that notion of trying to understand how consciousness, mind, and matter are related, and therefore how we're related to each other. Now, there's a lot of evidence that forensically that ties in that the man whose image we see on the shroud was actually the historical Jesus of Nazareth. And I should say at the outset, I don't come from a Christian background. I come from a Jewish background. Well, like he did as well, of course. But I think I would also make the point that obviously I don't consider that I have any more right than any other human being does to say what Jesus would have felt or thought. But my own perspective on it, from sort of trying to study his life and what he taught and did and said, is that he wasn't really about religion in the sense of dogma and so on. He was about sense and reason, and that what he taught and can be, I believe, understood as being rationally sensible without needing to see it through the Judaic background that he came from, or the Christian orientation the Islamic, because they also consider him to be a prophet. And he sort of encompasses all of those religions and others, in the sense of all of them say that you should be kind to your fellow man and so on, your fellow human being, and so on, and all of them would adhere to the notion of loving your neighbor as yourself. So he encompasses the good in all of them, but I don't think he was really trying to suggest that people should follow particular rituals and dogma. But what he said, actually, I believe, actually made sense. And in fact, 2,000 years later, some of it we can see how it makes sense. He spoke about that there's two states of existence in which you can store your treasure, as it were. There's this physical universe where there's moths and rust and thieves, where everything breaks down. He was talking about the second law of thermodynamics 2,000 years ago. Or there's another state of existence where nothing breaks down. And interestingly, I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, the next bit in that quote goes on to say that the light of the body is the eye. If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's actually a clue about how the image formed on the shroud. And I think that basically, if the way I see it is this: if consciousness has no beginning, we can see that through simple rational analysis, that it can have no beginning or end. The physical universe does have a beginning, okay, that we call the Big Bang, which may, as Professor Penrose says, perhaps he's right. Maybe there's one Big Bang and then it goes into the heat death and then creates another Big Bang and so on. But still, this universe had a beginning. Okay, now how is it that the universe had a beginning and we didn't have a beginning, and yet we, in the sense of not as individual points that we call I, you, me, we, and so on, but that sentience itself is actually the creator of time? And you see, physical universe is the same as saying space, time, and matter. Okay, so and space, time, and matter is another way of saying separation. As soon as you have separation of points, you can have movement, you can have space, you can have matter. And so if once you have physical universes, you have separate identities, like me and you, and like each of the viewers. Okay, but fundamentally, the nature of what we are is fundamentally the same as we are awareness and we are will. We are that which perceives and that which acts, okay? And each of us have our own distinct memories and habits and experiences, and we each make different choices. But imagine for a moment that our perception had no restrictions, no prejudices, no limits, and so that empathy is a clue to that. Okay, because you're not limiting yourself to selfishness or the self or your body, but what matters to anyone matters to you, in the sense of that if anyone suffers, you feel that suffering. Right. So take that to its full conclusion, and fundamentally we are all one. And in a state, one shouldn't perhaps say before the Big Bang, but beyond the Big Bang, so to speak, in that state, we are all one. And then once the separation occurs, separation is space and time and matter. Now, I personally don't subscribe to the notion of a creating directive God. That doesn't mean there is no God, but it depends how you define it. Right. But interestingly, that we were talking about Jesus and what he taught, that he said, is it not written you, because people were angry that he would mention himself and God in the same sentence. Is it not written you are gods and children of the Most High, he said, to the people around. And he was quoting from what some people now call the Old Testament, when he said that. Now, that would mean that fundamentally our individuality, our self, if you like, is our restriction, but that without any of that restriction, we don't cease to be, except we cease to be restricted, and we exist as all, as one, as each other and everyone, with all of us without limit, and that's the state we came from. And yet we have become less than that. We've become separate, and there are all kinds of patterns of thought that promote more separation, nationalism, racism, whatever it is, all the things that divide human beings from each other and devalue in people's minds, in their imagination. They consider at least other people are devalued. Of course, I would argue objectively, there's no limit to anyone's value. But then people, not only him, but people like Jesus, and since we were mentioning the Shroud, then he's a good example of someone to mention, spoke about love your neighbor as yourself, because fundamentally, if in that state beyond time, which has never ended because it's beyond time, so it's still there, we are all one. And once you realize that, then, and I don't mean realize it as an intellectual exercise, we don't realize it unless we have complete empathy towards all human beings, and we realize it. That means we realize it. And so that's the natural way that undoes the entropic momentum that will naturally tend to make us diminish in our capacity. Now, that's the thing that and even if you ask an evolutionary scientist, people assume that evolution is there to, make something better, but it's not. And to be fair to the neo-Darwinists and so on, they're not claiming that it does. They're not, but people assume that they are. But actually, they're just saying that all it's doing is making something fitter to survive, because the fittest to survive will survive and propagate that same pattern. It's a bit like that pebble on the beach I mentioned. Okay, it's continually evolving to being smoothed out and having the shape of its curves such that the waves as they go across it minimizes the friction and minimizes further erosion. But all the time it's becoming smaller. All the time it's eroding away. But evolution maintains its existence within a situation that's breaking down. And you could argue, and many people have argued, that the most highly evolved creatures on the earth are the ones that are best adapted to survive, might be cockroaches or bacteria. Okay, cockroaches can survive nuclear war, and bacteria can, they can survive. They're called extremophiles, can live in hydrothermal vents where there's no oxygen, very high temperature, and we can't survive there. But that's the natural way of what would happen if, unless we do something about it, that we would naturally become lesser in our capacity. And don't be fooled, I would suggest, by the fact that we're becoming more advanced with developing technology, because being clever doesn't make you wise necessarily. And so this is the thing that as discoveries keep happening, the dangers are opened up from that. And once Einstein realized that E equals mc squared was that nuclear bombs were going to be made, and saw the context of it, he tried to petition world leaders to try and stop it from happening. But of course, it was too late by then. And in the same sense that technological developments without the human sense of understanding what the importance and value of a human being, well, as I say, transhumanism, mind uploading, all of these things could actually, through our, in quotes, advancement, it's advancement into destruction, that humanity could cease to be on this planet. So I think basically what I'm the points that I'm trying to make are that we, in understanding at least in trying to understand, making us start at understanding what we are, or each of us, what the reader of the book or the listener or viewer of this podcast, understanding. I'm interested in understanding what's looking out at the world from behind your eyes. That you that perceives the world and sees what you're looking at now, those are the contents of your experience, but they don't summarize what that is doing the experience. And often people say, well, anyway, nobody can define consciousness, so how can it be anything special? Well, that's an interesting question, and you have to look at what we mean by definition, because we always define something in terms of something else. Okay, so to someone who's never seen an aeroplane before, you would say it's like a bird that can go in the air, but it's not alive, and it can carry people with it, or something like that. And then you've got ideas that from their experience that you can compare it to. But what can you compare consciousness to? That you can't compare it to anything within its contents.
Right.
At least you can't compare it to anything objective. Right. You can only compare it to that which is subjective. So consciousness, you can never explain to a machine what consciousness is, because a machine is just a repository of information that never perceives anything. But a human being already knows what consciousness is, because they are conscious. And so in that sense, I'm just going back to the most fundamental aspect of our experience, is that we experience, that we exist in order to experience. And then all the rest follows on from that.
I love that. We're experiencing this, did we choose to experience this? Did we choose to have, is it consciousness coming into a bodily form? What is that? Those are those other questions that can continue on, which I love.
Well, I think it's an interesting point, actually, and a very important one that I do address in my book, in terms of the distinction between choice and consequences. It said that, and quite reasonably said, based on reason, that a butterfly flapping its wings in Amazon could cause a storm in Florida, because if everything is just poised just so, that the slight difference in the air currents because of chaos theory could make a huge difference. So in that sense, my view of the world doesn't lead me towards a fatalistic attitude, because I do believe in free choice, but I don't believe that necessarily we choose everything that happens to us, if you like. So people in the world who are suffering now, I don't necessarily think, oh, but that's okay, they've chosen that so that they can learn it. No, that's where the notion of us being our brother's keeper, as it were, comes in. That a lot of it is, a lot of what people experience, they haven't chosen, but other people's choices might make it happen or not. Right. And then some of it, just by being in a physical universe, then where the chaos prevails, things like asteroids can happen, volcanoes, earthquakes, and all of these things that are not necessarily anything that anyone has chosen to happen. And I think, this is why people like Jesus, the Buddha, and many others taught that this isn't this realm of existence where we have physical bodies. That's not the sort of end point, as it were. That yes, there is suffering in this world, and that there is another way of existence that is open to us to achieve, that where we're not subject to those things, to death and decay. Ironically, you see, death in the physical sense may happen first. Although I don't believe anyone should. I don't believe in suicide or euthanasia or anything like that. But that it may be because we don't know what. I don't think anyone can know enough to judge that another person's or their own life should end at any particular point, because we don't know what opportunities are there. But I do consider that, and this is again based on evidence from near-death experiences, that when people come back and they're resuscitated, they say that when they have their life review, as it's often termed, where they experience their memories from their life, they actually often experience it as everything that they have done to others, they experience as though it was being done to them. So if they were ever nasty, deliberately caused harm to others, they feel what that was like for that person. Or if they were kind, they feel that kindness as though it were being done to them. So it sort of reflects it back, and that would make sense with this notion that fundamentally we're all one. And so I do think that actually all of the religious traditions did have a notion of reincarnation, and the one in the New Testament, as it's called, is when one example of it, when Jesus is talking to the disciples and asking them, who do people say he is, and some say, well, some say that you can't be such and such because before that can happen, Elijah has to return. And he said, well, Elijah has already returned and people didn't realize it. And the text says, and they realized he was talking about John the Baptist. Hang on a second. Elijah returned as John the Baptist, and you believe that that's what they understood after he'd taught them all the things that he'd taught them. So do you think perhaps maybe he taught them about reincarnation then? If they would understand what he said, to tell them that one human being has returned after dying as another human being. I think but I think in that sense, that what people like the Buddha was teaching in terms of nirvana and so on, is that that you can achieve a state where you don't have to come back anymore. Although he also taught about what he called the bodhisattva vow, that if you did achieve that state, you might still want to come back because you want to help the others. In that sense, I think fundamentally, in the sense that we've made separation happen, we've made division happen, and we've become restricted. We've sort of put ourselves in this physical universe, which makes us open to all sorts of things happening. But I don't think that means that that we choose everything that happens, or that if something happens to someone that we should imagine that they've somehow deserved their fate. So we shouldn't. I think it's still the onus is on us to do what we can to help each other.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. Dr. Silverman, where can folks find you on the internet?
Well, if the website andrewsilverman.co.uk, which has links to the book, and there's a Facebook feed that goes with that has several of my interviews and so on listed. My book is called, my first book was called A Burst of Conscious Light. I didn't choose that title, by the way. That was
oh, really?
That was the publisher.
I love it.
I mean, because one could argue that the point that I make is that that light or anything cannot be conscious, that your brain is not conscious. As soon as you say, and your body is not conscious, but you are consciousness, and your consciousness happens through it's expressed through the brain, in terms of your brain is sending signals to your mouth so you can talk and so on. But actually, the consciousness. Anyway, the book is called a burst of conscious light, and that is published by Inner Traditions. As I say, the website andrewsilverman.co.uk. There's also which has many of my talks on there, and there's another website, lightoftheshroud.com, which also has some of my interviews and presentations and things. So. Yeah, and it is. The book is available from Amazon and can be ordered through ordinary bookshops as well.
Oh, it's highly recommended by me. It's a fantastic read, and I absolutely loved it. Any upcoming books? Working on anything new right now?
Yeah, I do have sort of a germ of an idea, as it were, for taking things a bit further, but we'll see.
Excellent. Well, I implore everyone to definitely keep in touch and monitor your website. So any information, I'm sure you'll disseminate that there.
Definitely.
Dr. Andrew Silverman, thank you so much for joining me. This has been an absolute honor, and I've enjoyed this. This has been fantastic.
It's very kind of you to say so. I'm honored also to have been invited. Thank you.
And there you have it. I absolutely enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Silverman. I can't thank him enough for just taking the time and sharing that energy with us today. You can find Dr. Andrew Silverman at a couple of places. You can find him at andrewsilverman.co.uk, as well as at lightoftheshroud.com. And be sure to look for Andrew Silverman, the author, on Facebook. If you're listening to this podcast, please take a moment and share it with someone who might enjoy this content. And please give us a rating if you wouldn't mind. We're a new podcast, and by you rating it actually helps us reach more folks. If you're watching, we hope you're subscribed to the channel. Take a moment and hit that notification bell so you can find out about new episodes as they're coming out. You can find us on Instagram at itd.jcosta, as well as on Twitter at itd_jcosta. Thanks again to Dr. Andrew Silverman, but most importantly, thanks to all of you for taking some time and listening to the podcast, sharing the podcast, and watching the podcast. So, until next time, take care of one another and keep thinking for yourself.